Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I'm going to be walking you through some opening lessons to be learned from the Chess 9LX event that actually just wrapped up. So we're going to take a look at some of the biggest opening sort of disasters and successes throughout the event and see if we can apply anything learned to some real chess examples that I'm going to get to sort of near the end. So there are two main opening topics that I want to focus on for tonight that are sort of accentuated in Chess 960. So in these Chess 960 games, you'll oftentimes find a lot of very early pressure or attacks on a specific weak point in the position. Players will identify sort of a starting weakness in the initial position that they're given and base their opening play around it. So that's topic number one. And topic number two that I want to focus on is the idea of being left with one bad piece. This is something that often happens in 960. Players are able to develop almost all of their pieces, but then there seems to be one piece that sort of gets left behind, and that can be detrimental to the entire chess position. So let's jump into it here. The first game I wanted to show you guys is one between Hikaru Nakamura and Peter Svidler from the event, and this is actually one that Nakamura perhaps did not capitalize on to the fullest extent. Had Naka won this game, he would have walked away with clear first in the events. Instead, of course, he shares that first place prize with Magnus Carlsen. But let's see what happened here. So this is the initial position we were given, rather they were given, and it's a rather interesting one, right? We have the bishops on their initial starting squares, so probably not going to be too many difficulties getting these guys developed. Any normal centralized pawn move will help to develop these guys. The king is starting in a fairly safe position on the queen's side next to this rook. The queen, also in its initial position, is likely going to be able to develop without too many problems. But then we get to these knights over here in the corners. And we'll see that these knights sort of become the story of the opening play in this game. So let's see how both players treated the developing of the knights in this game and who it worked out better for. So Nakamura starts out with the move 1 to e4, and this is a very sensible move. It helps develop the bishop, helps develop, in fact, this rook and the queen, right? In all aspects, probably the best opening move here for white. Black responded, Peter did, with the move d5, which is a perfectly sensible move. So in regular chess, of course, this is looking similar to the Scandinavian. And the Scandinavian is sort of sometimes seen as slightly dubious because after captures, the queen can immediately be attacked with the move like knight c3. Of course, that's not actually going to be an option here for white, as the knights are located all the way over on the king's side. So this was Peter's opening idea. We also see in real chess that the queen does sometimes develop out to the center early on, if this idea of knight c3 is for some reason not really available to white. Or of course, the same applies in reverse, with black not being able to kick away a queen on d4 with knight c6 and many Sicilians that we'll see. In the game though, Hikaru was well aware of this, so he pushed the pawn up to e5 instead. And now Peter Svidler plays a really interesting move of bishop f5. So fans of the Caro-Kann, I'm sure are well aware of this idea. You push c6, d5. If white plays the advance, you can develop this bishop out to f5. But I wanted to ask the chat room what your initial impression of this move, bishop f5, is. What do you feel in your heart about the move bishop f5? Is it a good move or a bad move? Let's talk about it. Same impression as Hikaru. So, of course, the chat is referencing Hikaru Nakamura, a very expressive player, did make quite a number of faces when Peter first played this move, bishop f5. So on the stream, the commentators were also very critical of this move, bishop f5, because it does allow white to develop with tempo with the move knight g3. Of course, white now solving this problem of where to put these two knights quite early on by bringing this knight out to g3 with tempo. However, I think the problem actually goes a lot deeper than simply losing a tempo in the opening. While obviously losing a tempo isn't good, Black's problems are much, much more severe than the simple loss of a tempo here. And that problem is this knight on h8. With this bishop now sitting on g6, we'll see it later gets harassed back to the h7 square. The big problem for black in this position is that this knight is simply going to be unable to develop itself. And we'll see that black makes some very, very serious concessions quite early on in an attempt to get this knight out to a reasonable square. But with good play, Peter never should have gotten this knight into the game and would have been facing a very, very difficult game. Hikaru continued reasonably accurately with h4. We see h6 by black to give this bishop a flight square. Of course, h5 was threatening to trap it. Hikaru now advances with h5, and we see now bishop h7. Of course, though, this knight, still unable to develop out to g6, is going to be facing some very, very serious issues. White now continues with d4, black plays the move e6, and white develops with bishop d3. And these are all very natural moves that you would expect in a Caro-Kann, except, of course, this knight is on h8 rather than c8, right? Black would much prefer to have this knight here and this rook here, and then he would have a very natural Caro-Kann position, and everything would be fine because all of black's pieces could develop out, sorry, not on c8, on b8 rather. All of black's pieces could develop out naturally. However, here, we'll see after bishop takes d3 and queen takes d3, black's position is quite simply awful. Not only can this knight not develop, it's now in direct danger of being lost tactically after the move queen h7. And because of this, Peter already has to play this awkward-looking move f5. And after f5, white now has permanent advantages in this position. f5 is not a move that black was interested in playing. It weakens the e6 square, the g6 square. It sort of leaves this g-pawn in the dust, being hampered now by white's h-pawn, and it doesn't even solve all of the problems that this knight actually has. So in the game, Hikaru played a very, very bad move, which is e takes f6. This move is just simply wrong, and it allows black now to find some freedom with his pieces. This bishop can get to an open diagonal. This knight has natural development, and this knight as well is going to be able to come to some pretty natural squares after the move knight f7. If instead Hikaru had chosen a more accurate move like knight 1 to e2 or knight h3, heading for this f4 square, we would have seen a situation where Hikaru is utilizing all of his pieces while Peter is going to be unable to find an effective use for this knight. And already, Peter, of course, has made some very distinct weaknesses in his position just to save this knight. So if the game had continued with knight 1 to e2, we might have seen some moves such as knight to e7, knight f4. Now due to the weakness on e6, this knight would have to move again. Something like knight to c6. This bishop could come out to e3. Knight f7, for example, is an attempt to develop. We could even see white castle kingside. And now after knight g5, you might think that this knight is serving a useful purpose, but the simple move f3, and now it's very, very clear that this knight is doing absolutely nothing on the g5 square. It has no forward prospects. It is, for the moment, defending this pawn on e6, but sort of in a very awkward manner. And of course, coming back to f7 or h7 is not going to improve black's position. And quite honestly, I would be very willing to call this position just strictly winning for white out of the opening. White can, in the future, look to expand on the queen side with something like c4. The black king is going to be rather stuck over here, and, sort of a ready-made attack for white. This knight has prospects of coming back to e2. Hikaru could also potentially invade on the king side with knight g6 and knight f4, and the game, I think, would be very, very easy to play, to say the least, for Hikaru, and very difficult now for Peter Svidler. Instead, of course, we did see this move, e takes f6 played instead, and I think this is just a pretty terrible mistake by Hikaru Nakamura. It allows Peter Svidler to actually capture with the queen as well, aiming for this f2 pawn, and then we'll see in a few short moves, it's actually Hikaru's pieces that end up being slightly awkwardly placed. Black queenside castles, we see knight g4, queen h4, knight e5, and this horrible knight on h8 now trades itself off for this knight on e5, and all of black's pieces find reasonably harmonious squares without too much difficulty. Bishop d2 is played, knight c6, f4, bishop c5, and black's pieces are controlling the center. This knight is looking a little bit out of place for white, with a lot of pressure on all of white's weaknesses that have been created, and even the rooks for black are going to have useful squares on the back rank to either support the center or challenge white on the half-open file. So all in all, what should have been an opening disaster for Peter ended up being a reasonable position for him. In fact, one that he could have gone on to win had he played a bit better in the middle game. But at the end of the day, the players did end up drawing this position after, of course, a very complex game, as they are known to have. But the points I wanted to highlight in the game are these opening decisions that were made by either player and how they very directly led to a worse position for Peter and then a perfectly fine position for Peter. This move, bishop f5, is where the problems all started. Not necessarily because it gives up a tempo. Yes, that is sort of a bad aspect of this move, but definitely because it's taking away any future development that this knight could have had. All right, with that in mind, let's take a look at another example from this event where the opening didn't quite go according to plan. And this time, we're actually going to see Hikaru Nakamura on the other side of things. Of course, this is another case where the good opening position didn't result in the result that the player was going to hope for. But we'll see that Alireza actually managed to apply quite a bit of pressure to Hikaru from the opening in this position. And once again, these ideas are going to start as early as move 2, move 3. So in this initial position, we have Alireza, well, actually both players, with a bishop starting opposite a queen. And this is a very interesting dynamic that, of course, you don't see too often in normal chess openings, but does appear sometimes in chess 960. And in addition to that, there are also some weaknesses in the initial starting position, and we're going to see that that is going to be very, very relevant in this case. So of course, last game we had the idea of one piece sort of being sort of trapped due to an early mistake by black. In this case, we're going to see how Alireza managed to force that kind of favorable situation by attacking some of the weak points in the black camp. So right off the bat, who in the chat can tell me what points are a little bit susceptible to an early attack in this chess 960 position? Who knows? Who can tell me? So Professor L Axis has the right idea here. Both f7 and f2 are looking quite vulnerable in the initial position. You can also notice that a7 and a2 are undefended as well. No pieces on the back rank defend them. But we'll see in the game that that was the less relevant weakness because the move b3 is very natural and was played first and foremost. So with this diagonal closed, it's not as easy to get to a2. And then b6 was played for black as well. And so already, I would like to turn the question to the chat room again. White to move and pose black some very, very serious problems. All right, white to move and pose black, will pose some questions to black. There are already significant issues in the black position that require very accurate play to avoid getting a worse position right out of the opening, right out of the gate. What can we do here? So yeah, of course, the first thing to notice is that these bishops are, for the moment, hindering some natural development for both sides. So that's definitely going to come into play here, is how can we continue to hamper our opponent's development? So, okay, as I said, the other idea is we want to take advantage of these weak points in the position. Using these weak points, Alireza managed to force some very serious concessions from Hikaru already from move 2. So the move I'm thinking of, the chat room has not gotten it, so if you still want to think about it, go ahead and pause the video here. The move is actually to play this simple move, knight f3. You might be thinking, well, what is knight f3, right? This is nothing, right? Why is knight f3 such a big deal? Well, first and foremost, this isn't going to be the type of position where black is happy about giving up the bishop pair. Of course, that is a huge concession that high-level grandmasters are never going to want to do this early on. And so with that move out of the way, white is quite simply preparing his natural development of g3 and bishop g2. And after this comes into play, all of white's pieces are going to be in the game. Of course, aside from the rooks, which can be figured out sort of a little bit later on. His rooks will be free to move on the back rank, support the center, or head any half-open files. So not only is white preparing the natural development of the rest of his pieces, notably also the white queen would be in effect on a long diagonal battery, so the white queen would even have a use, but he's actually threatening to play the move knight g5. Now, is he going to play knight g5 against any old move? Of course not. But if black tries to respond in suit with the move knight f6, now all of a sudden, either knight e5 or knight g5 is a very, very serious problem. This weak point on f7 is suddenly almost indefensible. Black can play the move king e8, but of course this is really not what black is interested in doing. Giving up castling rights so early on would of course, again, be a huge concession. And black, of course, could also consider the move bishop d5, but after this, the move c4, bishop e6. Of course, this bishop is not in its ideal placement, staring at this pawn on c4, and some very strange squares on the queen's side as well. And from here, white could do a number of things to increase the pressure. Simple development would be fine. d4, d5 would already be very, very threatening. And even moves like f4 and f5, still trying to get at this f7 weakness, very much could be considered here for Alireza. So with all of that in mind, black is sort of unable to play the move knight f6 without getting a worse position after the move knight f3. And we see that this symmetry is already being broken quite early on. In the game, Hikaru chose the move f6, but this is quite simply a move admitting that black is going to be worse out of the opening. Perhaps a little bit better for Hikaru would have been to try the interesting move e6. Now, of course, if something like knight g5 or knight e5 were to be played, the move knight d6 is available to black. So he keeps this option open, and now it's probably not actually in white's best interest to go for this. So what if white just continues to develop naturally? Continues to develop naturally with g3. Well, now after e6, knight f6 is actually going to be playable. Of course, now with g3, we have introduced a pin to the queen, so these moves are less good. In fact, this would be losing a piece for white. So those tactics not going to work out. And so after knight f6, bishop g2, it's true that black cannot keep total symmetry with g6. After playing e6, you wouldn't want to weaken that many dark squares, but bishop e7 would be playable. And from here, natural development could ensue, something like d4, takes, knight c6, and we'll see here that all of the black pieces are going to be in the game, and even the queen can get into the action for black. For example, after knight c3, for bishop b2, for example, wouldn't want to give up the bishop, castles, knight c3, h6, castles, and queen h7. And we see that black is able to complete development, even the queen eyeing some nice squares on this open diagonal, and all of the black pieces participating in the game. Now let's compare this with what happens to Hikaru after the move f6. Of course, f6 isn't a developing move. In fact, it's taking squares away from the black pieces. And so with this early attack, not even a direct attack, but the threat of an attack to a weak point in Hikaru's camp early on, Alireza has gained significant opening advantages. And let's see how he continued to press those. He started with simple development of g3, c5, bishop g2. Hikaru, now unable to develop the knight to f6, had to settle for knight c7 instead, which is, I think, just a worse square. c4 is the continuation, and now perhaps black could consider trying to play something like g6, but again, knight g5 threats are in the air, and white can start breaking in the center already. Instead, Hikaru chose e6. We see white castle, bishop e7, and now with a developmental advantage, thanks to some time wasted by black, Alireza breaks in the center with the move d4. Hikaru chose to simply castle, and now I would like to turn it over to the chat room again. White to move and cause black some very serious difficulties once again. White to move and give black some very serious difficulties. So there are some good ideas in the chat, and I won't lie to you. Normal moves like rook fd1, like rook cd1, even a simple move like bishop b2, these all maintain the advantage, but Alireza found the very interesting move d5, and the point of this move is to start an attack on these light squares in black's center. If you ignore this move, for example, white is just going to have a very nice open bishop along this long diagonal, and if you capture on d5, as Hikaru did, then you're going to be met with a move like knight h4. This pawn on e6 has given up control over this f5 square, white threatens to come to it, and of course this pawn is now pinned along this long open diagonal. And this might be an idea you're familiar with from normal chess that does sometimes occur in the Queen's Indian defense. But let's continue. Hikaru found the best move, which is to play the move f5, defending the square with the rook now, and introducing the idea of bishop takes h4. We see knight c3 by Alireza, attempting to regain the pawn. Bishop takes, g takes, h5, but now already knight d5, takes, 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 and white more or less has a winning advantage straight out of the opening. The reason for that being, he was unable to get this queen into the game, and Hikaru had to waste a lot of time and go for inferior development thanks to this opening pressure that Alireza managed to apply. In the game, Hikaru played the move king h7, and now after queen back to f3, this pawn is very, very difficult to defend. In the game, Hikaru played the move rook c6, we see the move king h1, queen g8, and then if Alireza had captured a free pawn, he would have enjoyed a very substantial advantage, I think about +2 according to the computer. But in the game, unfortunately, he chose rook g1, and this started to give away a lot of the advantage back to Hikaru, when after g6, Hikaru has preserved his kingside pawns. White should still be a bit better because this knight on b8 hasn't gotten into the game yet, but in the game, unfortunately, Firouzja was just a bit outplayed by Hikaru, and Hikaru did manage to walk away with the full point. But that's not the point of this lecture. The point of this lecture was this outstanding opening play. We see the subtle move knight f3, allowing white to develop all of his pieces naturally and forcing black into a very awkward situation where he was forced to play this slightly unhappy move of f6, which interferes with the rest of his development. Why doesn't white mind getting those double isolated rook pawns? Well, let's take a look, right? And in this case, white doesn't mind because of these very forcing variations. The open g file actually helps him, and he's just so ahead in development that these weaknesses created by black are going to more than compensate for any weaknesses of the double isolated pawns. Also, this idea of bishop takes knight is very much a double-edged one. Many of you might be familiar with a famous Bobby Fischer game against Boris Spassky where something similar happened. Giving up this dark squared bishop for this knight can be a very risky maneuver, right? And we see in the game that Alireza gets good dominance over this long diagonal thanks to this bishop sacrificing itself for the knight on h4. All right, I want to keep moving things along here. We have a lot to go over tonight. So let's take a look at another game between Wesley and Alireza Firouzja. And finally, we get to see the youngster not only playing well in the opening, but actually converting on his advantage. Alireza did have a couple very impressive games, despite not having the greatest score overall in the tournament. But I was most impressed, really, with the positions he was getting out of the opening in many of these games against the world's best players. After queen f3, would king g8 get a repetition, or white has more there? Yeah, white is definitely not obliged to repeat moves in that position, and I think a move like king h1 and rook g1 to follow would be very, very good for white there, Manny. White's not interested in repeating. Let's continue though. In this game, we have, I believe, a very, very similar position as to what we looked at in game 1. In fact, I think it's the same position from the same round, with the knights stuck in the corners. And here, once again, we're going to see black making use of a weak point in the white camp. So let's take a look. e4, e5 was played in the game. Like I said, very natural. Of course, in Peter's game, we saw the move d5, which led to a bad position for black, but e5 is very natural. And in the game, Wesley So actually starts with the move knight g3, solving the problem of the knight in the corner immediately. And now, who here can tell me why knight g3 might be a bad move for white in this position? Already, we see on move 2, mistakes are being made by the players. So, black to move and take advantage of knight to g3. So some people in the chat are suggesting the move g6, which is pretty natural. You just want to hamper this knight's development, but that sort of falls into the trap of taking away your own developmental squares. Of course, the problem with knight g3 is that it leaves behind this f2 pawn, and this is going to be a very critical weak point. And after Alireza's second move, bishop c5, developing with tempo, attacking this weak square, black is already pretty significantly better from move 2. Not something you would see every day. The reason for that is because it is actually incredibly awkward for white to defend this pawn. In the game, we saw Wesley So actually choose this move queen to e2 to defend it, which of course is not ideal, interfering with the development of white's bishop. Had he chosen something like queen f3, well, he's sort of running into the same issues where now this knight is not going to have any square to develop out to. Also, of course, you're asking for some danger here of getting this queen trapped with some bishop g4 tactics that, again, do occasionally show up in real chess, if you're familiar. Also, black can very much consider breaking in the center immediately with the move d5. So after e d5, for example, knight f6, like I said, these threats are already looming in the position, and black is significantly better. So perhaps fearing some of those threats, Wesley chose the move queen e2. But now, after knight g6, of course, white cannot respond in kind with bishop c4, and knight f4 is already keeping up the pressure, keeping up these threats. d3 was Wesley So's choice, but now after knight f4, queen f3, we go ahead and see Alireza play the interesting move, pawn to g5. And this move just cements this knight on a great square on f4. Again, white is not going to be super happy about capturing this guy, giving black uncontested control over this critical dark square diagonal. And this queen on f3, once again, not going to be a happy piece, with issues of bishop g4 to follow later in the game. And so already, like I said, I love Alireza's position thanks to his early attack on a weak point on f2. Let's see how the game continued. We see bishop e3 by Wesley, fighting back a little bit. d6 by Alireza, wasting no time in getting developed. Knight f5 by Wesley So, taking advantage of this little hole that Firouzja left behind. Knight f6 now. g3 is Wesley's attempt to kick this knight out, but now we see that because Wesley has been forced into making some opening concessions, black no longer has to worry as much about this light square diagonal. So while white couldn't really consider taking on f4 thanks to this dark squared bishop, black very much can consider taking this knight on f5, and did so in the game. We see e takes f5, g4, queen d1, and now knight d5. And we see this knight unable to develop itself to its normal squares, this bishop also remaining undeveloped, and black controlling the center very thoroughly with all of his pieces in the game, and a weakness on f5 to very freely attack. And this is just a fantastic position out of the opening for Alireza that he managed to convert into a full point. Let's see how we continued. We saw bishop c5, dc5, h3, h5, takes, and Wesley finally gets developed, but now we see queen to d7, f3, and Alireza just picks up this pawn on f5. Interestingly enough here, the move queenside castles is actually significantly better for Alireza, thanks to some threats of playing this move c4 and breaking open in the center. But in the game, Firouzja just captured this free pawn, and it was enough for him to convert his advantage into a full point. Again, highlighting the fact that Wesley still has not completed development, and Firouzja is already up a full pawn. In the game, of course, he didn't get to keep the pawn forever. F takes g4, queen f2 was played, takes, but of course, these pawns on the g file are going to be rather weak, and it's clear that Firouzja has a distinct advantage in development, central control, and piece activity. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I want to switch gears a little bit now. So we saw what all of this looks like in chess 960, right? We saw all of these opening ideas, mistakes starting from the second move with the world's best players, and these two big ideas of attacking a weak point in the position and hampering the development of one of the opponent's pieces. If you can keep just one of the opponent's pieces from getting into the game, then it's very likely that you end up with an opening advantage. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's great and all for chess 960. I'm glad I know this now about this one chess variant. But these two ideas appear very, very often in normal chess, and that's the big secret that no one is telling you. So, well, of course, everyone is, I'm sure, familiar with the normal opening chess principles, things like develop your pieces, control the center, castle the king. You might not be as consciously aware of these ideas, of these early weak point attacks, and these early ideas of keeping one piece in particular out of the game. So I want to switch gears now, go from these wonderful chess 960 games to looking at some regular chess openings and how these ideas sort of manifest from the real initial position in chess. So let's click on over here and take a look at some weak points in chess. So the first thing I want to start with is the move e4, right? And black can respond in many ways. Of course, we have the French defense after e6, and coming through, we have d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5, a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and knight e7. So this, of course, is just a theoretical position in the French that many of you are probably aware of. Many of you might also be aware of the main move to play for an advantage for white in this position. So, who can use one of these chess 960 principles to tell me the main move for white in this position? How can white play for an advantage out of the French? And while, of course, this is a theoretical position, and many of you just might already know the move, that can definitely be divined using this principle that we can take from the game of chess 960. So what should white play here? So yeah, of course, this is the start of the poison pawn variation in the Winnoir, and the move queen g4 is the main move. And what is this idea? Well, we're simply attacking a weak point very, very early on. And it does force a concession from black. Either black allows us to take this pawn on g7, going for the poison pawn accepted, or he can defend this pawn with an awkward move like king to f8, where black now gives up castling rights, commits his king to the king side, and is making a very serious concession. Of course, moves like rook g8 would sort of be ridiculous, and queen g4 forces black into a little bit of an awkward position. Of course, nowadays the theory goes very, very deep in the poison pawn, but this is the same exact idea that we see in chess 960 cropping up in regular chess. White attacks a weak point in the position, and black must either concede that the g7 pawn is lost or make some other type of concession, like the move king to f8. So that was our first one. Let's take a look at some other weak points in the game. I want to go now to d4. We have d5. Let's take a look at c4 to begin with. c6, of course, would be the Slav. And just playing some natural opening moves, knight c3, knight f6, c takes d5, c takes d5, bishop f4. I would like you guys to tell me if the move bishop f5 is a good move for black and why. Is bishop f5 a good move for black here? So once again, we are very early on in a normal chess game from the initial position, so many of you are probably just aware of the ideas here. But if you find yourself in a position where you're not aware of the ideas, once again, this fallback of this weak point principle is quite useful in the opening stage of chess. So bishop f5, of course, as the chat room is saying, is not the greatest move for black in these positions because queen b3 applies some very awkward pressure to this weak point here on b7. Of course, there are also some tactical implications involving knight takes d5 as well if queen b6 were to appear on the board. Although I don't think knight takes d5 actually works here because the d4 pawn is hanging. But it does allow white at least to get this pawn structure, which can be slightly awkward for black here. And I think this position is, in fact, a pretty distinct advantage for white. So once again, you might consider the move bishop f5 in some cases if you're unaware of the opening theory here necessarily. But as we can see, bishop f5 not going to be a good move thanks to this idea of queen b3. Much more common, by the way, for black is to play knight c6, e3, and now you can follow it up with bishop f5 as queen b3 hits a little bit less hard as knight a5 is a good response to defend all of the weaknesses in the black camp. Black can also be a bit more cautious with a move like a6, and now something like rook c1, for example, bishop f5, queen b3 is really not getting the job done here, as now after knight a5, queen a4 check, there's even this move of b5. But important point here, developing the knight out to c6 before bishop f5, and we can start to understand why when we look at this idea of weak squares in the opening. Okay, what about knight a5 and queen a4? Yeah, and that's just a theoretical line. The bishop would actually retreat back to d7 there, and it's fine for black. Now I want to take a look at a very, very similar idea, again, attacking a weak point in chess, but I want to introduce the idea of white very, very purposefully, in this case, attacking a weak point. And the idea here isn't so much that it sort of, just happens to be if the opponent is developing nonchalantly, but white very actively tries to attack a weak point in the opening. So, for example, bishop f4 from white would start the London variation. We have knight f6, e3, e6, and then there's a very interesting line in the London that sort of comes about after this move, knight to c3. This is an idea sort of championed by Yobava and Richard Rapport, and the idea is sort of multifold. Number one, white often just sort of goes a little bit crazy and launches some kind of kingside attack, not moving this pawn, allowing some queenside castling potential and developing this knight early. But number two, this very directly aims for a weak point. Who can tell me what the weak point is? What is the weak point in the position? And yeah, of course, Professor Axis has the idea again. In this case, it's going to be this pawn on c7. And so, if you're facing this with black, you might not be totally aware of all of the theoretical ideas, but you probably are aware of this weak point on c7, thanks to these lessons we can take from Chess 960. So as such, black should be, in my opinion, a little bit cautious about this pawn on c7. For that reason, the main moves here are actually bishop d6 is most common, immediately relieving some of this pressure, and the move bishop b4 is common as well in order to prevent this knight from stepping to b5, attacking c7 once again. These are the main moves. And believe it or not, the third most common move is the move a6. And this very directly says, I see what you're up to. I'm not allowing you to play knight b5. But let's, for the moment, say black continues a little bit naively with bishop e7, still a perfectly fine move. Let's say bishop d3, still continuing development, and something like knight b to d7. Now, already, as we see in chess 960 games, black is going to be worse here thanks to this idea of a weak point being targeted early on. So, if knight b5 is played here, black already is in a pretty terrible spot. The only way for him to defend this pawn is to go bishop b4 check, bishop a5, and now after b4, bishop b6, we have the classic chess 960 case of black making an early concession because he wasn't aware of a weak point in his position. And as I said before, this can occur in real chess, as we are now seeing. And so white, of course, would be better here because this bishop is way, way, way out of play on the b6 square, staring at a very strong central pawn on d4. So I want to open it up to questions a little bit. Any questions on this idea of targeting weak points in regular chess openings? Does anybody have any questions about this one in particular? Any questions at all? All right. If not, I want to move on to the second idea. So this idea of targeting a weak point in chess does occur quite often, as we are seeing. And one last fun one. I'm sure you all are aware of the weakest square in the starting position in chess, f7, being a common target, especially for beginners. And of course, there are ideas of attacking this guy early on, stuff like the fried liver, going for scholar's mate. And these ideas are very, very well known, but they all sort of spring from the same idea of attacking a weak point. With that in mind, though, let's move on to the second idea discussed in this lecture. And this idea actually occurs even more often in real chess than the first. So much so that I think it should sort of be taught along with the idea of the regular opening principles in chess. It sort of gets a mention with the idea of developing your pieces, but what I'm specifically talking about is when one player picks out a piece in the enemy camp to sort of target. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean target as in trying to win that piece. They target a piece in order to make sure it can't develop comfortably. And if they succeed in this, if the bishop or knight cannot develop comfortably, then the player can expect to have a very, very serious opening advantage. So let's jump into it here. Let's start with the move e4 and the move c6, jumping into the Caro-Kann. All right, d4, d5, and the line I want to take a look at here is the line with the exchange e takes d5 and c takes d5. So who is familiar with the exchange Caro-Kann? And who's ahead of me here, already picking out which type of piece we are going to be targeting with the white pieces? Go ahead and post it in the chat if you want. I'm not going to pause just yet, though. Natural development for white would be bishop d3, of course. Black can play the move knight c6. We see c3, and now knight f6. And I want to pause here now. White to move and find an interesting idea to target one of black's pieces. And I mean target in this case, not as in threaten to capture, but a target as in prevent development. One of black's pieces, their development can be prevented here very, very seriously. And if black's not careful, black could get into a very seriously bad position. So white to move here with an interesting opening idea. Of course, there are many moves for white in this position. But yeah, Professor Access in the chat, once again, has the idea the move h3 is very, very common here. And I think Bobby Fischer was sort of famous for playing in this way. At least he did bishop d3 and c3. I don't know if he really came up with this h3 idea. But the idea here is that we've taken away the f5 square from the bishop, and now white takes away the g4 square as well. And now I want to ask you guys, what should black do in response to this h3 idea? If black is not careful, this bishop is not going to get developed, and he's going to be worse. And we'll take a look at that for sure. But what should black do to ensure that he's not worse out of the opening here? There are really two big ideas that you can choose from. Two big ideas. So yeah, the chat room is along the right idea. They're mentioning the move g6, but who can tell me why g6 is solving these opening problems for black? The chat has also come around to the second big idea, which is this move e5. And e5 is a very, principled move. Your opponent is wasting time with h3, so black should counterattack in the center. And of course, this is solving the problem of the bishop by just opening up the position. If we take a look, we can see d e5, knight e5, knight f3, for example, knight takes d3 with check, and eventually we'll see that with the light squared bishop off the board, black doesn't have any real issues in developing this guy either. For example, bishop e3, and black can now develop this guy at his leisure along this open diagonal, coming to e6 in some cases, or also coming out in the other way. But the idea I want to focus on here is this move g6. g6 is a great way to solve black's opening problems in this case. All right, so what is the idea of g6 here? Why does g6 fight against this opening idea? So, all right, I'm not sure if the chat room is coming around to the idea just yet, but g6 solves black's opening issues because black is actually planning to come to f5 anyways. This is the very direct idea. The point is, after white continues development, we are ready to play bishop f5, and we are willing to give up this pawn structure in order to, number one, secure the e4 square, and number two, make sure our bishop gets developed. Make sure it gets off the c8 square and gets into the game. And yeah, this opening line is perfectly fine now for black when all of his pieces are going to be contributing to the game. I also want to ask you guys another question in this position though. After something like e6, and let's just play a few more moves here. For example, bishop f4, bishop g7, knight bd2. Well, actually, probably bishop d6 is fine here, but let's just say the game continues like this, knight bd2, something like castles, knight e5, and something like knight e4, for example. So why is this bishop for black not a problem here? It looks like this bishop isn't actually doing much, sort of just biting on a rock here on d4. But why can we count this bishop as developed? Count this bishop as in the game, as contributing. Why is this bishop not bad? Is bishop f5 actually playable? Yeah, bishop f5 is one of the main variations in this opening. Number one, it's defending the king and controlling the center a little bit as well. Those are great points. And number two, we actually have a plan to improve it. We have a plan here as black to break down these dark squares from white with a minority attack of b5 and b4. So it's really, really important that we understand that this bishop is not a bad piece because it is, number one, compensating for the fact that we gave up a g-pawn, and number two, it is going to be improved later on due to black's very, very natural plan. Okay, and so yeah, you guys did great here. Once again, the point of h3 is to prevent this bishop from developing, and so black, of course, should play something like g6 or e5, fighting back against this idea very, very directly. Now I want to take a look at what happens if black sort of concedes and just plays this move e6, right? If you're unfamiliar with the opening, you might think, whatever, all right, my opponent stopped me from developing my bishop, I'll just play the move e6 and it should be fine. Well, in this case, you are very much going to be worse out of the opening thanks to this bishop on c8 not getting developed. Is h3 a good idea? h3 is a playable idea. Of course, in chess openings, there should always be ways to equalize in most of the main variations. So just because black can equalize doesn't mean h3 is a bad idea. It just means, it's going to be a chess game. So e6, and now white's job in the opening is sort of completed. He's prevented you from developing this bishop to a good square, and now white just develops normally. Something like knight f3, bishop d6, castles, castles, rook e1. And we'll see with very, very simple normal development, knight e5, bishop b7, knight d2, knight f4, for example, g6, g4, and now h4 in this case. And white has a very, very pleasant advantage. By the way, this is taken from a game between Anish Giri and someone with the last name of Ryazantsev, who's around 2650 level grandmaster. And the point I'm getting at here is this piece is not contributing to this chess game. And that is why Anish Giri is able to sort of go for this crazy kingside attack, because this bishop is not playing, and this bishop is going to be a useful attacker for white. Now, in the game, black actually did manage to fight back and draw against Giri, which, make your jokes in the comments now. But the point is, Giri got a very pleasant opening advantage thanks to this bishop not contributing to the game. And again, because of that, he was able to go for this kingside attack and probably should have won the game with good play. All right, backing on up, let's take a look at a couple more examples here. For example, in d4, once again, let's go back, d5, c4, c6. I want to take another look at the Slav. And here, the move c takes d5 comes into the exchange Slav. And this is a line that I actually play myself. Bishop f4, knight c6, e3, e6. And in this case, e6 is fine for black. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. Bishop d3, knight f6, for example, knight c3, bishop d6. And this is the move that I'm actually going to take issue with here, bishop d6. So here, I would like you guys to play with the white pieces, white to move, and get a very solid opening advantage. A very solid opening advantage. And this one is a little bit deeper than my last question. So take a few seconds, see if you can find some way to secure a permanent opening advantage here. White to move. What can you guys come up with? Exchange off black's good bishop. I mean, that's a start. That's a start. But it's not the end of it. It's not the end of it. So let's talk about what the point of black's opening play was, right? Black played e6 very quickly, sort of trapping in this bishop, but then he followed it up with bishop d6. And with bishop d6, what is he doing? Well, he's fighting for very serious control over this e5 square, right? And what happens if black gains control over the e5 square? Well, then he's probably going to push a pawn to it, and after pawn to e5, of course, then this bishop can once again come back to life and breathe. So the stable opening advantage that I'm talking about directly fights against black's idea of pushing for e5 and activating his pieces. So see if you guys can come up with it with this hint. So yeah, Manny has a beautiful idea. You can take on d6, queen takes d6, and now rather than the natural move knight f3, when black has the option to play e5 in most cases, we can play the stellar move f4, taking advantage of the fact that we know that this bishop cannot really get developed comfortably after the move f4. Just for your reference, from an opening database that I'm using, this position has been reached well over 100 times, and after the move f4, white wins 46% of the time with a 34% draw rate, And after the move knight f3 and castles, black wins 92%, or sorry, black doesn't win 92% of the time. Black draws, well, both players draw 92% of the time. So that is a well over 30% difference in the games from this one decision. So f4, I think very clearly gives practical opening advantages as well as I think objective opening advantages, thanks to hampering the development of this bishop, where knight f3 would allow eventually, of course, black to break in the center with e5 and develop this bishop along this open light diagonal. 30% where var wins. No, I don't think var plays this line in this way. var goes for an earlier knight f3 and has his own way of fighting back against this variation. But yeah, the point I'm getting at is always be on the lookout for these opportunities to hamper your opponent's development early on. All right, and I do have one more example I want you guys to take a look at. So once again, we're going to start with d4, d5, c4, c6. And in this case, let's start with knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, g6, c takes d5, c takes d5, and bishop f4, bishop g7, and now e3. And this one is not going to be a white to move or a black to move puzzle. I want to ask you guys, what is the evaluation of this opening position? Does white have an advantage? Is it equal? Does black somehow have an advantage? Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think and why. Tell me what you think here. Plus 0.2, says someone in the chat, so more or less equal. Quantum Head says white has more developments. Turkey says white has the advantage, but he doesn't say why. Professor Axis gives me the name of the variation and says it's plus equals. And so yeah, Manny has finally hit upon the correct reasoning here. Once again, it all comes down to fighting against one of black's pieces. In this case, black chose to bring this bishop out to g7 very early on, and white has managed to play against that by removing this c pawn, right? We see that after g6, white chose to take on d5, and black recaptured with the c pawn. And this was a very deliberate decision by white to make this bishop bad. How does it make this bishop bad? Well, this bishop on g7 only makes sense if it has a future on this open diagonal. Remember, we talked about this briefly in the Caro-Kann variation that I mentioned, where that bishop does have a future because black can go for a minority attack on the queen side. In this variation, that future is very, very dim because c5 is not playable and black has no way of undermining this pawn on d4. And so white has an advantage here simply because this bishop is not going to be developed well. White has targeted this bishop in the opening and has an advantage because of it. And once again, you need only to look at the database scores to see this reflected. White wins about 50% of the time here, which is sort of an absurd winning rate. And that's just about going to do it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this lecture where we took a look at some opening ideas from the recent Chess 9LX event, where some of the top players found themselves in trouble quite early on. And then we took a look at how this is reflected in a variety of different chess openings. Once again, those two key ideas I really went over tonight, the idea of targeting weak squares early on in the opening, which does show up in chess, and the idea of targeting one of your opponent's pieces to make it bad, to make it stay out of the game. These two very specific ideas are sort of everywhere in normal chess openings. We just don't always think about them because we're so used to sort of just studying the theory rather than understanding these really key principles behind them. If you guys are watching live, we are going to be continuing next with a Tactics Time class live on Twitch. If you're watching the YouTube version, that is going to be all from us here tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. Once again, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.